Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Today we're once again joined by Brody Burton of Imagine If. Brody's been on the show before, and we've done a joint episode with our podcast and his, so we're going to come back and revisit that concept today. So I hope that you stay with us after the break, and we'll talk to you soon.
Hi there, guys. This is Alexis and
Don?
Taking a little break from the podcast to tell you about one of our favorite things, and that is what, Dad?
That's Audible. And
what does Audible do?
Audible does everything. At least it does everything when it comes to playing audio programming for you. So that's, I typically think of it as being audio books, but it's not just books. It can be periodicals, magazines, theatrical productions, podcasts even now. Just anything that you can imagine that is audio can come through Audible.
Absolutely, absolutely. We, of course, we are avid readers, both Dawn and myself, but we like to be lazy sometimes with our reading. We like to be read too, so that's where Audible comes in. And if you're like us and you like reading, but maybe want to try being read too for a change, we have a little deal for you to check out Audible. What's that deal?
The deal is an opportunity for you to get a 1-month free subscription to Audible, which comes with 1 credit. A credit is how you purchase, again, an audio book, an audio program, whatever the case might be. And so if you follow the either the link that's in our show notes or go to www.audibletrial.com/aforkintime, you'll be connected there. You can see how to sign up. And again, you'll get that 1 month at no charge, a chance to try it, see if you like it. And you'll also get 1 credit, which will go towards, again, an audio purchase. That could be a book, fiction, nonfiction, whatever it might be. And I guess the other thing to mention, Alex, is what happens if you also happen to be an Amazon Prime member?
That means you actually get 2 credits. And as we get into the holiday season, I'm sure a lot of people are taking advantage of Amazon Prime. So take advantage of this too. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you actually get 2 credits with this deal instead of 1. So maybe 2 books.
Yeah, 2 books. Or that way you can check out different variety. You may choose a fiction and nonfiction genre, for example, to see how you like that. One of the things I know that Alexis and I often talk about is sometimes a great reader can actually make a good book even better. And a lot of the productions now, the audiobooks and other audio programs are done by excellent readers. And I know for me, I can think of some of my favorites, don't want to belabor them here, but sometimes they can bring a whole new life into something you may have even already read before by hearing it spoken.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so we encourage you to take advantage of that offer. Again, that's a link in the show notes on our website, or go to www.audibletrial.com/aforkintime. Thanks.
Welcome back to the podcast. Don here today, and I'm joined by Brody Burton. And Brody, I know that this is going to show up on Imagine If, so I'll let your normal listeners hear your voice now, and they'll understand if they're listening to this recording on your podcast that it's you, but it's you and I together. So how you doing today, Brody?
I'm doing good. I'm doing very well.
Good. For those of you that are Fork in Time listeners, you'll know that we did a joint episode about 30 episodes ago, and Brody, of course, is the host of Imagine If. And if you're listening to this on the Imagine If feed, you already knew that, so I've told you additional information that was unnecessary, but we're excited to have him here also appearing on the Fork in Time feed. So Brody had reached out about doing another joint episode, and I'm glad that he did because I'd been thinking about it too. So Brody, we talked a little bit about a topic, and I'm going to let you introduce what that topic is to our listeners here, telling us where we're going to break time apart and how we're going to analyze it. So, Brody, tell us what we're going to do as a topic today.
Okay, so about 20 years ago, there was a major event in world history that changed the course of the 21st century for the United States and for the world. And that event was 9/11. However, only about a year or so before, there was a very, very close election, and we very, very realistically could have had Al Gore as the U.S. president during 9/11 rather than George W. Bush.
And so using our concept from a fork in time, our fork's going to be that there was a different outcome in the 2000 election, which, as you pointed out, was a very close election, was a contested election. And we sort of already agreed off podcast, we're not really going to go down the rabbit hole of all the things we could talk about on that election, except to say there's lots of scenarios other than even the one that most people might be thinking about, which is changing the outcome in Florida, that could have changed the outcome of that election. It was close.
Yep, New Hampshire was very close too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we end up with a newly elected now president, Al Gore, who was the vice president, of course, for 8 years during the Clinton administration. And the events of 9/11 happened roughly 8 months into the new presidency. In the regular timeline, that's in the George Bush presidency and George W. Bush presidency. And in this case, we're now talking the Al Gore presidency and the alternative here. I don't think there's very many of our listeners who aren't familiar with the real timeline of history, but of course that was early in Bush's presidency in the real timeline. And the way that I've always thought about it, in some ways, 9/11 hijacked whatever the Bush presidency would have been, because from that point on, we were living in the post 9/11 world. And would you agree, Brody, that's a fair thing to say that whatever the Gore presidency would also have been, once 9/11 comes, the Gore presidency gets hijacked into its version of a post 9/11 world?
Definitely. It was always going to be different after September 11th. There's
Right.
no way to avoid it.
And so what we're going to try to do here is apply what we know about Gore historically as a politician, and historically in terms of what he ran on and the types of things that were important to him. And then both try, I guess, really to understand, at least in my way of thinking here, Brody, and certainly jump in if you think differently or need to expound upon this, looking to see how things, again, could have stayed the same, what would have carried through, but also how the events of 9/11 would have changed because of the personality that's there. So what do you think is the number one thing that would be different in a Gore presidency post 9/11 from what we experienced in the reality of a Bush presidency after 9/11?
Well, the first thing would be a completely different look to foreign wars. Bush was in favor of them. Gore was opposed to them. Afghanistan was probably not avoidable, but Iraq was. I think the biggest thing would be America never would have gotten involved in Iraq. And the second biggest thing is we would have been in Afghanistan for a significantly shorter amount of time.
So is it a fair way of summarizing what you just said there, that the equal likelihood that pursuing those who had carried out the deed, the Taliban who were in Afghanistan, bin Laden was in Afghanistan, or at least, there near the Pakistani border, that region of the world, more focus on that would have happened anyway. And you think an even larger focus on that without sort of the split focus of there and Iraq?
Yeah, it's a fair way to summarize it.
Okay. And so under that scenario, what's different? I mean, obviously it's different if you don't go into Iraq, but how does that play out? What are the dominoes that fall after that?
Well, I forgot to talk about this off podcast, but Saddam Hussein stays in power. That seems like a fairly big thing. America is overall less involved in the Middle East. And additionally, I think more on the home front, Al Gore probably would have, President Al Gore in this scenario probably would have advocated to be involved less in the Middle East to avoid having a 9/11 style event in the future, because if you look at bin Laden's reasons for doing it, although they were completely unjustified, we do not support terrorism. It was primarily because America had gotten involved in the Middle East during the previous Bush presidency, during the presidency of George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, the Gulf War and all that. So, and along that line, I think he would have combined that with his green environmentalism agenda to try and have America be less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and to try and use green energy made in America.
Yeah, and we were talking about this off podcast, as I mentioned, Brody, then, and I'll mention it again now for the listeners here. That was the first thing that struck me as being not something that I had really directly connected in my head before, but something that actually resonates as something that I could, value you bringing it up and suggesting is something I very much could see that could have happened. Because without getting into the current debate, and I know that we have listeners that probably follow on both sides of this debate for what's known as anthropomorphic climate change, man-induced climate change versus natural cycles, and we don't want to go down that path because all we'll do is make half the people that listen to us probably unhappy. But regardless of which way you go on that, one of the things I think that Gore could have done under that scenario is make the argument for alternative fuels, development of American resources, maybe, pushing forward some of the things that we have seen in the last 20 years, which is the growth of the natural gas industry as still a fossil fuel, but an alternative fuel to coal and to oil, is could have done that in a way that it wasn't solely framed in the context of the environment. There would have still been the environmental element, and that would have been an important part because of Gore's disposition towards it that we knew already existed at the time. But it would have given an economic and, geopolitical reason, not just a political reason, but a geopolitical reason to go the other way. And so I think you would have had the chance maybe to bring converts, regardless of whether they believed at the same level that Gore did about climate change or had that same passion from just the ecological point of view. You would have brought other converts there because now there would have been a reason more than just the climate.
Yes, and I don't really think that a whole lot of people would really. I think Gore would push it. I don't know how well that would be received, but then again, 9/11 did convince people that we needed to be involved in the Middle East, which historically is not always the greatest idea.
It hasn't worked out well for a lot of major powers. That's one thing that you can definitely say. Historically, it's not been something that has often led to success. There's no doubt about that. So, assuming that happens, let's carry that a little bit forward here. So let's say there's able to get some, congressional support, funding, some type of national program that moves more towards the initiatives that are about America becoming energy independent. That's always been something both parties could sort of get behind. They had different ways of thinking about how it would work, but independent. The first thing that pops into my mind is you probably, electric vehicle technology probably would have seen more of a boost. You may have seen alternatives for electricity production with fewer, coal resources, again, natural gas resources. Do you have any particulars there that you've thought about that maybe come to mind in terms of how that would have played out specifically?
On the whole general subject, I believe it was 1997, the U.S. entered an agreement in Kyoto, I'm probably butchering it, city in Japan, to agree to some of these same standards. And yeah, with the electric cars and general electric energy, I think it would be something Gore would push for. I don't know what kind of success he would have because it's going to take more than 4 or 8 years to be able to implement something that's changed the natural gas industry and the automobile industry, which have been around for, at this point in history, coming up on 100 years.
Right. Yeah, I think you actually make another interesting point there, which one of the challenges of any of these big type of initiatives, be they viewed as being more conservative or be they viewed as being more liberal, it sort of doesn't matter, is that when you're talking about things that can't be done overnight, and there are some things that no matter how much money you throw at them, you can't change the time component requirement. Is that the nature of every political system, but particularly the American political system, is you have to have something that can sustain itself beyond 4 and 8 year chunks of time because something happens every 4 years at the national level, happens every 2 years with a major part, or happens, in 6-year rotation cycles that cause the mix of players to change. And you've got to have something that can sustain itself despite the potential changes or the potential pressures that come with that.
Yes, and on that note, at the time that Gore would be president, at the time of around 9/11, the Senate was split very, very thinly. It was a Republican majority in our timeline because it was a 50-50 Senate, and Dick Cheney had the tie-breaking vote. But in this timeline, Joe Lieberman, who is interesting, we'll probably get to later, would have given the Democrats a majority, and the
Right.
House had a narrow Republican majority. So I think there'd probably be a few major congressional battles to get through a lot of this legislation for climate change policies and for green energy, probably which Gore would push, but there would be a lot of resistance to it in the Republican caucus, and I don't know what kind of success he would have had,
Yeah,
and
I agree.
even he might not get the ability to throw so much money at it. It would be an uphill battle.
Right. And then I think, the interesting thing about this is, again, assuming that you have a fairly quick resolution to whatever conflict the U.S. chooses to engage in. Your suggestion here is that Gore probably leads down a path that's a more limited, focused on the U.S. presence in Afghanistan for the reasons it's there, versus sort of also at the same time a presence in Iraq. Um, Foreign wars are always unpopular, regardless of who the party is of the president that's in
Yeah,
office. That's just the nature of what they are, just because that's just a very American thing.
they
But
usually
then,
start out popular, then end up very, very unpopular.
correct, there's that trick, and again, because it's it's a factor of fatigue, it's a factor of, would you have had clear objectives? It's tough to you can establish clear objectives up front, but then what happens if you don't achieve them? Again, not getting down into all the particulars here, making it as current as it could be, but definitely a factor that would have been playing in the 2004 now reelection campaign would have been, I think, a referendum on what, as it was for in our real timeline for Bush, where he won reelection more handily than he did in 2000, but not without a challenger, and or without a challenge. The 2004 election would have been a referendum on Gore's handling of the response to 9/11 and whatever the view was on the intervention in Afghanistan. And you're suggesting possibly also a referendum on his initiatives along the idea of energy independence and the U.S. becoming less dependent on the Middle East as an energy source. So that election would have also had that as a major campaign issue.
Yeah, it
Okay.
would have centered very, very heavily around that.
Right. And one of the things when I mentioned the hijack, to me, one of in fact, it will be an episode of A Fork in Time at some point, because for me, it's fascinating, especially living in Texas and being from Texas, having seen what George W. Bush did as the Texas governor before he was president of the United States. I happen to take the mindset that the Bush presidency that we know, the second Bush presidency, George W.'s presidency, would have been very different than what it was in reality if it had not been for 9/11. That's why I use the term hijacked, because I think what he intended to do, what he intended to focus on, particularly some of the domestic things that he intended to focus on in his presidency, obviously took a back seat to the things that he had to deal with internationally as a result of this terrorist act and the things that came from that. And to me, what was intriguing about this when you mentioned it off podcast is that how potentially Gore could have taken the act and used it to push forward what he wanted to on his domestic agenda versus it running against his domestic agenda.
Yeah, that's all very true, but this may be somewhat related, but with the subject of domestic policy versus foreign policy, I think a theoretical Gore administration would always be more equipped to handle to handle a domestic centered political sphere, whereas Bush would have been more advantaged in a foreign policy sphere. So I think that's probably where the difference come from. Like, for example, George W. Bush's vice president was Dick Cheney, former Secretary of Defense, I think either under his father or Reagan. I don't know
He
specifically.
was under his father.
Okay. Whereas Gore would have had Lieberman as his running mate, well, he had him as his running mate in reality. In this alternate timeline, he would be the vice president. Lieberman was a senator from Connecticut, a very moderate senator from Connecticut, and I think that would have helped Gore's administration become more centered on domestic policy post 9/11, whereas Bush would have been centered more on foreign policy post 9/11.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, and for all the reasons that it tends to be the sort of the DNA of the two parties and how they tend to approach things historically up until everything that sort of shifted in the last few years. So I want to focus a little bit on the 2004 election under this scenario because I think it's also one of the more interesting twists to this fork in time. The first question would be: now you have Gore standing for re-election following his first term in 2004. This now represents 12 years of Democrats having control of the White House. Who do you think is the likely Republican nominee in 2004? Is it George Bush coming around for a second shot because he just barely missed in 2000, or do we bring a different likely candidate into the fray on the Republican side?
So I think to answer that kind of backwards, Bush would not have been the nominee. He wouldn't have ran. At this point, he may or may not have still been governor of Texas. Maybe at this point he would have retired and Rick Perry probably would have taken over. But I think, and to give a few candidates here before I say who I think would win, Utah Senator Orrin Hatch would have probably run and done well, and he ran in 2000 as well. Steve Forbes, and there would probably be a few others, probably a few other senators and governors that would come to prominence under a Gore administration who we simply do not know because we only have the hindsight of a Bush administration, so we don't know who would have risen to the top. But regardless, I'm going to guess that Arizona Senator John McCain would probably be the most likely nominee given his experience on, well, he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he would know a lot about foreign wars. And I think at this point, the war in Afghanistan and would still have been popular, kind of. But the Gore administration would not be because of their more domestic focus, when I think Americans would want a more foreign policy centered political sphere because of the events of 9/11.
Right. I think those are all insights that I would concur with and agree with. That, and of course, realizing that McCain was the nominee in 2008, you're really just advancing him 4 years ahead of the time when he actually did secure the nomination.
Well, it happens a lot. The Republicans tend to nominate their runner-up in the next cycle. In 2008, they nominated McCain. 2012, it was Romney. Let's not get after that. So we don't want to get too current.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. It tends to be somebody gets in the race, gets the recognition, builds an apparatus that they can reactivate in the next election cycle, and it seems there's a reason that works. There's a reason that flows for all kinds of reasons. Part of it's money, part of it's organization, part of it's exposure. It all plays together. So I agree with you. It's not for all the reasons you've mentioned. It's not anything far-fetched to imagine that there would have been a John McCain challenge to Gore now seeking re-election in 2004. Do you think it's still Lieberman on the ticket with Gore in 2004? I mean, normally folks don't change in midstream here. Do you think he would have been loyal to his vice president, or do you think there's anything that might have caused that change as well?
A few presidents have changed their vice president. The most notable one I can think of is Abraham Lincoln. But I think that Lieberman probably would have disagreed with Gore on several key issues. And in 2008, Lieberman had openly campaigned for McCain in our timeline, and eventually I believe he either left or was thrown out of the Democrat Senate caucus and formed his own third party and caucused with the Republicans. So I think it would be interesting to see if we could have a McCain-Lieberman ticket.
Wow. That would be unprecedented in the sense of the in that scenario, obviously for that to happen, you would have had to have had Lieberman's actual resignation from the office of vice president.
I don't think you wouldn't have been forced. Like lots of vice presidents have ran while still in the office. That tends to be more cabinet members. I believe cabinet members cannot.
Yeah. Of course,
Like
running with the opposite party against the president who you're serving gets a little strange.
it would. I don't think there's ever been, aside from the previous president, and I guess Ronald Reagan, most presidents have stuck with their parties their whole lives, and
Yeah.
that applies to vice presidents as well.
Yeah, again, it's the rare event for whatever reason that it's happened. It certainly happened in American history. In fact, one of the interesting little pieces of trivia I know I picked up about a month ago is how many more, there's been more vice presidents than there have been presidents for that reason, in the
Well,
sense
that
of
reason that reason then they've died a lot
right.
quicker
And
than
then, of
presidents.
course, the flip side of that, having no way to replay, I was suddenly reminded when I was looking at that, it was actually for a trivia question that was done inside of our office. Suddenly realized how many times, up until recently, up until the 22nd Amendment, we had no provision for replacing the vice president. So we went for extended periods of time without a vice president, depending upon when the president actually died. I was actually looking here at who some of the other candidates were in
And
2000 to see other potential candidates besides McCain who would have come back. You mentioned Forbes, you mentioned Hatch. One of the things that jumped out at me as being interesting, just because of the connection that would have been with Gore, is that the former governor of Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, a Republican, uh,
that would be interesting.
actually had made several presidential runs. He withdrew before the primaries in 2000, in 2000, in 2000. But that idea of him of him coming along and being able to challenge Gore on his own turf in Tennessee for that vote would have
Wow.
would
Just
have been an interesting
because
concept.
I don't even think there would have been challenging on the turf, but Gore wasn't especially popular in his home state of Tennessee. He
Sir,
lost Tennessee to Bush. He
mhm.
lost it, although it had voted for Clinton in 92 and 98.
Yeah,
But
and one of the
Tennessee,
fascinating things about that, Brody, is that's really during that period of time when you see the party transition in the South, where in many states like Tennessee, Texas was this way back in the day. You had conservative Democrats. You essentially had two wings of the Democratic Party before Republicans had really gained um, a viability in a state where it was a true two-party state. In fact, they used to call Texas a modified one-party state. Tennessee was sort of in that same ilk as were a lot of other southern states. There were two flavors of Democrats, Democrats and Dixiecrats kind of thing.
West Virginia, as an example, that just
Right.
came to mind. It's like they had, up until very, very recently, their entire congressional delegation, their governor, all were Democrats, but it was a solid state on the presidential level for Republicans. Even now, it still has a Democrat senator, even though every county voted for the Republican candidate in the last election. Not to get into the current
Right.
affairs of things, but yes, I think
There's interesting trends there.
yes,
Well, and the,
very,
the other
very.
name that jumped out at me here, we're going to settle on one so we can carry forward with our alternate timeline. But the other one that jumps out at me that's an interesting one to look at was uh, uh, the former Secretary of Labor, wife, former Senator Elizabeth Dole, and who ran in 2000. And the idea perhaps of a female candidate on the Republican side stepping into what that would have meant in 2004 is just another interesting thing that crossed my head and be curious to know. Because again, the environment of who would have run in 2004 is different when you're challenging a Democratic incumbent versus when you are in the real timeline situation where there's already a Republican in the White House, and so people are serving other roles and doing other things because there's no, very very rarely, although it does happen, is the incumbent party challenged. Do you think there's any possibility? This goes along the line. Do you think there's any possibility, talking about the Lieberman situation, that Gore could have faced that unusual consequence of a strong challenge within his own party for the nomination in 2004, even though he was the sitting president?
I think I don't really know.
Fair enough.
I don't know.
I don't know either. That's the wonderful thing about
I'm trying to
speculating with
think
alternate
from-
history, right?
Yeah,
You don't
I'm
know.
I'm trying to think from the perspective of Lieberman. If I were the vice president of the sitting president, would I want to, and disagreed with him, would I want to challenge him and probably not get the nomination, because I cannot think of a single time in American history where that has happened. I could be forgetting something, but I cannot think of I guess Lyndon Johnson. He kind of dropped out.
Yeah, but in that case, he chose not to run, so it didn't become an issue in
A
'68.
footnote there. We'll leave him as a footnote there.
Yeah.
I,
Again, I think certainly in modern U.S. political history, so the 20th century moving forward, it's certainly never been successful.
no.
Contemplated maybe a third party candidate, but a successful direct challenge to a sitting incumbent president within his own party, where it was successfully done, is basically a non-starter. It's never actually happened.
Yeah, usually they don't ever get more than one delegate in the convention.
Right.
Maybe two.
Okay,
I'll be
so we're
generous.
going to take your assumption, which I like, and I think it's probably the most sort of logical assumption based upon. And you and I talked about this off podcast. It's the rare thing that someone who has lost in the previous election, even if it were close, gets the chance to come back and do it again. That doesn't happen very frequently. I think the first thing that popped into my mind, I think I'm right, was maybe Stevenson twice against Eisenhower. Maybe fits that category. But it's that's a rare thing too. So it's unlikely that Bush comes back. So I like your idea of McCain as the Republican nominee. Who do you think's it? You mentioned Lieberman as a potential running mate. Who else might be his running mate if there's not somebody coming from what was the other party?
Well, I haven't researched this one as heavily, but I think maybe if he's still governor of Texas, maybe George Bush. Doubtful. Maybe Rick Perry if he's at this point governor of Texas, because I don't know. I know governors of Texas.
Yeah, well, and you're also looking for a way to capture that very large portion of the electoral vote. So you're very often you're looking for someone from Texas, someone from Illinois, someone from California,
or someone from swing states is very very very
right.
often
Right.
Well, usually.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
So McCain and his generic balance the ticket swing state or big state affecting vice presidential nominee up against Gore in 2004. What's your take on who wins that election in this alternate timeline?
On who wins the overall election, I think it would probably be very very close. I think that just because it's extremely rare for the incumbent party to hold on to the White House for more than 12 years. It happened in this alternate scenario. It happened with Reagan and Bush Sr. It happened when FDR was president forever. Aside from that, that's going three examples in the last 100 years. I guess the Republicans had it for a little bit in the 20s. 4 examples in the last 100 years from now, when the incumbent party could hold on for more than 12 years. Plus, overall, the American people are still very upset about 9/11. I think that'd probably be the case no matter what. And they might see Gore as not wanting to engage in the Middle East. And I think that might create some tension there. And going back to the running mates thing, if you look at who's more advantageous in swing states, Gore's probably not going to win Tennessee. We didn't really say if Lieberman is or isn't on the running. If Lieberman's not on the ticket, I think we'd probably see someone like John Kerry on the ticket, simply out of the fact that he agreed with McCain on more positions, and in our timeline he ended up being the 2004 nominee. They're both from states that are pretty solidly decided, and McCain being from Arizona, which is and has been a key swing state, and all McCain would really need to do would be pick someone from the an area like Michigan, Pennsylvania to really do strongly. So I think McCain would probably win.
Okay.
By a margin similar to what Bush won in 2004.
Okay. So I think all of those are solid analysis points from my standpoint. We talked a little bit about off podcast. I know I've already shared with you, I agree with most of them. Is if for no other reason than that tendency for the U.S. political pendulum to want to swing back and forth, and 12 years is a long time, especially with the backdrop of what's happened in the 3.5 years prior to that election. So picking back up on some of the things that we thought might have happened during the one-term Gore administration, is he a blip on the American political radar in terms of lasting? Obviously, he's the president during 9/11, would be remembered for that. We probably would remember a speech that he gave from the White House on that day versus the one that George W. Bush gave. Do you think
Or
there's
not
even
even from the White House. Like Bush's most famous 9/11 speech, the one I can recall, is where he's in New York,
yeah,
his arm around a firefighter, saying, "We can hear you." Like that's probably his best political moment of his entire career.
I would agree with that. The two things the three things that stick out at me remembering the events of that day, and we were talking about podcast, Brody, you're making me feel old because you weren't even born yet on that day, which is a whole other interesting thing to talk about because of just how memorable it was. For my generation, it was our Pearl Harbor in a way. You knew where you were, and you remember every detail of that day. But I remember the speech that night from the Oval Office after he had worked very hard to get back to Washington. Was bound and determined to deliver that speech from the White House as just a sign of, this has happened, but there's, we're still the United States kind of thing. The speech you're talking about, no doubt, the visiting the site of the visiting Ground Zero. And then the other thing I remember particularly from that day is because I've seen it so many times in documentary is when he's in the classroom in Florida when he's first informed by aides of what's happened. And they're trying to end that event there and very quickly get him to a place of safety, but he's actually at elementary school, so he doesn't want to cause panic in terms of how that happens. And just those are the three enduring images that I have of George W. Bush as president around 9/11. There would have been some type of similar things, maybe not the same thing down like you're talking about with a bullhorn at Ground Zero, arm around a firefighter kind of thing. But Gore probably would have had a similar type of moment, a similar type of image that we would have as the iconic image of him as the 9/11 president.
This made me think of something we should probably get to later. Yeah, I think Gore probably would have had. I don't really even remember what the question was.
I guess my question was, what would have sustained out of a one-term Gore administration?
Yes. Well, I think McCain being the moderate he was, no matter how you look at it, I think a lot of, if he can get climate proposals through, I think Gore can be remembered for that. I think Gore would probably be remembered for Afghanistan for being almost like a reluctant wartime president. A lot like how, dang it, I'm forgetting his name now. Who's the guy who came before Teddy Roosevelt?
Directly before would have been William McKinley.
McKinley. Yes. McKinley was remarked at the time for not wanting to go to war with Spain.
Right.
This was right around the time of the Spanish-American War, which took place primarily in Cuba as well as in the Philippines. And he really didn't want to get involved there. And I think that would be very, very similar to what we would see Gore doing 100 years later.
So he's a reluctant wartime president. We spent a little bit of time talking about this, potential way that this would have been a pivot for the green agenda. Do you think that comes to an end with McCain? Does that survive? In other words, would we have gone down a different path even if it only had deflected slightly because of Gore being in the office for the 4 years in terms of the U.S.'s position on climate change or how we would be addressing those issues as well as the energy dependence issues because of the brief time that Gore was in office?
I think that not all of Gore's proposals will stay forever, but I think that maybe half of them will. I use half as an arbitrary number. But I don't really see McCain repealing a ton of climate policy. And it would also depend on who would come after McCain, because McCain's going to have to deal with the Afghan war turning unpopular and maybe still a recession in 2008. Maybe the butterflies get rid of that. But we could very easily see McCain also being a one-term president and having another Democrat come in 2008. Whether it's Barack Obama or someone else, I don't know. I don't even know if Barack Obama would ever get elected to the Senate from Illinois under a Gore presidency.
Yeah,
Maybe he would have.
that's one of the things that was running through my head was trying to determine what the Obama trajectory would be. Of course, he really came to the fore in terms of national recognition in 2004, delivering a speech at the Democratic National Convention. Does he get to deliver that same type of speech at a Gore at a convention that's going to renominate Gore? Does Obama even get the opportunity to deliver that type of speech and be thrust into more of a national role at that time? Then there's the question of, which certainly was the case in 2008. Another Democratic presidential candidate being Hillary Clinton. Would she have been the most likely then challenger to a McCain in 2008 or 2012 or both, somewhere in that particular thing that's there, and how that flows forward? And I guess the other question is, we sort of skipped over this because we sort of talked more of the focus on Afghanistan. I can believe a Democratic administration, a Gore administration, being more focused on Afghanistan and maybe not doing the same things that the Bush administration did vis-a-vis Iraq. But now, as you pointed out, you still have Saddam in power. And so there's always that risk of the other sort of unintended thing that happens. The other thing that hijacks a Gore presidency is, some type of aggressive action that Saddam takes again against Iran, another, invasion of whatever that might look like. He's still in power, so he's still in position to be a problem. And if he becomes a problem, what does that do to the Gore presidency or a subsequent presidency?
Well, I think first, I don't think the leader of Iraq, I can't pronounce his name all of a sudden, Saddam Hussein, I don't think he'd be stupid enough to do a 9/11 style event. I think Kuwait's right next door. What worked, didn't work, worked-ish once, may work again. I think that would probably be the aggressive action I would see him doing. But I don't think Gore would probably have to deal with it. I think that'd probably be something theoretical President McCain would have to deal with.
Right.
And to the Obama thing, the DNC speech is what launched him nationally, but what launched him in Illinois, and he never would have gone to give that speech if he hadn't been the nominee for the U.S. Senate for the state of Illinois, was his overly big, completely unexpected landslide in the Democratic primary for Senate from Illinois. I think he won like 70% of the vote, which for a state senator is pretty good. And we're not going to see anything like that in 2022, probably. We didn't see anything like that in 2020. From my knowledge, I don't follow state senators all that closely because there's so many of them. That was in 2000. That would have been 2004. So we would have seen a Gore administration, relatively unpopular. So say he does give the DNC speech, the Republican Party holds the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois, and if McCain has strong enough coattails, I think Barack Obama could possibly lose his Senate election in Illinois. In our timeline, he won by a fairly large majority, but then there wasn't an unpopular Democrat administration in power.
Right.
So I think if he plays his cards right, Obama could certainly still be launched into the spotlight. Maybe not at the Democrat DNC, maybe still. I don't know, because I don't know if we had settled on this. I think I'd thrown it out earlier. Kerry as a vice presidential nominee. He was the presidential nominee in 2004, so I think that is still quite possible. But it's also possible he could earn a name on drafting some major legislation or a speech on the floor of the Senate, or maybe something else. Maybe something else entirely. Or maybe he becomes known for coming close to winning the Senate election and not winning it. We've had that happen recently in Texas, not to get into current affairs again, but it would certainly be a possible thing to have happen.
Right. There's all kinds of ways, particularly with a national news media that continues to morph as we move forward in time, that you don't have to win to get noticed. And sometimes losing gives you the benefit of structuring what you happen after the election to prepare yourself for the next higher office, even more so than if you had actually won. Winning can handicap you because now you have to serve in the role, whereas losing close, losing in something that gets a lot of notice means that you have the flexibility to decide what to do after the loss.
There is that, but there's also the thing that Americans don't like to elect a loser. And especially on presidential levels, there's only one person I can think of who breaks that mold, and that would be Abraham Lincoln. And a lot of Americans did not like his election.
Right. Some things happen. There's a famous thing of how many times he ran and lost, and then he won the presidency. That's what he finally won, right?
He lost to Stephen Douglas in the Senate race just 2 years earlier.
Right. So
but
I
even
agree with that.
I don't even think an Abraham Lincoln-esque type person would be able to win the presidency under the environment today or in 2000.
No, he the things that he everything I've ever heard about, I'm thinking of Daniel Day-Lewis portraying him in Steven Spielberg's Lincoln being one of those things, but in other things as well, they talk about his voice being a high-pitched Kentucky twang. And the thing that strikes me is Abraham Lincoln by appearance and by that was not a made for TV political event. The good news was he was a political event before there was a TV, so that's why it worked out for him.
There's a reason Eisenhower was the last bald president. You kind of have to have the appearances now to be able to run for president.
Yeah. There's the the famous 60 debate between Kennedy and Nixon. How intelligent Kennedy was, and people that you hear this all the time. I remember this distinctly being covered in political science classes that I took in college. The people that listened to that debate on the radio declared Nixon the winner, and the people that watched that debate declared Kennedy the winner. And there's a lot to be said about what that meant for the medium and the impact that it was starting to have on how candidates were being perceived.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe our podcast could be a whole lot bigger if there were YouTube channels.
Well, and I've actually converted the audio part of mine into one, and nobody listens because nobody wants to watch a static image when they do it. But yeah, there's a very different. You make an excellent point. There's a very different thing there. So one thing that really just struck me, and I'm gonna have to come back to this, and maybe we'll do it with you at a different time. Just thinking about, you mentioned the butterfly effect and how that things. I think we often forget the power of coattails and down ballot elections that are influenced by what's going on at the high level. We know that happens. We know how that works. It's not that we're blind to it, but not realizing that changes the fate of individuals that either get a boost or that are negated as a result of those coattails.
Yes, like George Bush. He really earned his name, his connections to his father, and then in 1994 defeating, I believe it was Ann Richards for the gubernatorial election here in Texas. And then to address the point you had made earlier about, I forgot to answer, about Hillary Clinton, who knows if she could have won? She could have been Secretary of State for Gore, or she could have been senator from New York, or senator from Illinois, or senator from Arkansas, because she's been associated with all three of those states.
But you make an excellent point, because eventually she serves in the Secretary of State position in the Obama administration. What's to say that wouldn't have been something that she would have slid into in the Gore administration?
Yeah.
And so then she's never a United States senator. And
or a thought I had while saying that, she was often associated with Illinois.
Right.
Who else earned their star in 2004 in Illinois?
I think we talked about him. Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, again, to me, that's an interesting thing. And again, I don't think we talk about those ripples nearly as much because they're tougher to decipher and they're sort of more mundane. But the truth is, they probably end up having more impact, obviously, on the individuals than we recognize. But they probably actually have more impact on our future history because of what didn't happen as a result of, again, something down ballot. That's just
Of
the nature of how
course.
that works.
Of course. And to get away, well, kind of get away from ballots. And on the topic of the butterfly effect, so there were 4 planes involved in 9/11. 2 hit the Twin Towers, 1 hit the Pentagon, and 1 was taken down over Pennsylvania. Do you think that because of the butterfly effect, we could have seen the 4th plane go down into the Capitol building? What would have happened? Because
Yeah,
Congress was in session then.
right. In fact, there's actually an episode of A Fork in Time. I don't know if you've listened to it, where Alexis and I speculate on that. It's 42 minutes, and we talk about the fourth plane and exactly that. I mean, for those of you that are familiar with Tom Clancy and his novels, you know that that's how his fictional Jack Ryan actually assumes the presidency, is is through a successful. This is sort of it's one of those strange things to me because it was written before, a successful attack with a plane hitting the Capitol, which is a little bit scary in terms of, how much then reality could have taken over from fiction. But again, let's say you only lose, 10, 15, 20% of Congress, which would, be an entirely different tragedy. And we talk
That's
about on
still
that.
10, 15, 20% of Congress. That's still like 100 people.
Right. And those 100 people are people that are in positions today, potentially, that have influence. And again, the loss of life and the whole thing would have just been tragic enough, end of
Oh,
sentence,
yes.
period there. But then the ripples that go on, the butterflies that go on from that, go on for decades and potentially go on to affect things in big
Yeah.
ways.
Or even Congress was in session that time. I think it'd be entirely possible to see in a absolute worst case scenario, 99, 100% of Congress being killed.
Right.
In which case, we would have had a massive, massive political talent imbalance. McCain's candidacy is off the table. Lieberman's probably out as a running mate because he's probably dead too. Kerry, and I think we definitely would have seen a governor run because that's
Right.
just about everyone who's left, except
Right.
for. And
You're,
then they're
you're
gonna.
looking for somebody who can point to their experience as an executive when you've
Yes,
lost all of the other viable candidates inside of the
or
House.
experience period,
Right.
or experience period, because, well, I mean, there is the possibility that all 50 state governors appoint, because it's very often happens a lot when a senator dies or resigns, retires midterm for whatever reason, that a governor appoints a replacement and then there was a early special election the next year. Like that was happened in Georgia this last cycle. It happens before on other occasions as well. And then there were anthrax attacks not too long after this,
Right.
directed towards members of the Senate. So that could have been directed towards governors because the Senate's gone.
Yeah. It's a scary thing, and actually, the American television network ABC had a show, which I guess has now moved over to one of the streaming platforms. I'm not going to say which one because I'm not positive whether it's either Netflix or Hulu, but Designated Survivor, which was along this concept of where there's an event and there's an explosion at the Capitol, which basically the federal government, the elected part of the federal government, has to be rebuilt. And you have a low grade, essentially a lower tier cabinet secretary is suddenly elevated to the position of presidency. And what was fascinating to me about watching that show, it's actually Kiefer Sutherland who plays the president there, if you're familiar with it.
Ooh, I
The, the,
am familiar with Keith for Sutherland.
yeah, the thing was fascinating to me about thinking through that was how they tried, and they dealt with it, I think, as fairly as they could for a network primetime drama where you weren't going to go into all the details of this, but the challenges of, and of course, not every member of Congress died, but most did, the challenges of rebuilding the entire legislative branch of government from scratch is, something we've never had to deal with as a nation. We've certainly had presidential assassinations. We've had, major
But
events
even
like
then,
that. But just the
even then,
consequences of how you
Republicans,
reform 535 seats and how you make that happen and how it literally becomes hitting the reset button on, on politics and everything potentially. where you don't have there's no longer the benefit that incumbents have. So it resets everything.
Yeah, another thought is it could move things forward. Like if there's a special election in this would be September of 2001, this would happen. So November 2001, where you see maybe a little after that, where you could see Barack Obama coming to the Senate 3 years earlier.
Right.
And then there's also seniority is completely gone. So you could see competitive elections for President pro tempore of the Senate, which currently stands as the most senior member of the party in power. So right now that'd be Patrick Leahy of Vermont. It's varied over the course of time. Orrin Hatch, one of the presidential candidates we discussed earlier, actually was that for a period of time a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of lower level cabinet secretaries who really could be higher caliber. Like just to think of a few under the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. That's not really lower grade. Of all the positions, that's a higher one. Secretary of States tend to be
more seasoned people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I believe it was the Secretary of Homeland Security, Joaquin Castro. I know I completely butchered his name, but he's a major Democrat politician in Texas now. Andrew Cuomo was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development before he ran for governor of New York, and on and on and on and on. So we could see those people going to the Senate instead of the governorships and the other positions they went to.
Yeah. Hey, but we probably should reserve a lot of that comment for a follow-up show at some point, which I'd be happy to have you back on to do, which was just thinking through all of the various ways that 9/11 could have been different, and thinking about that particular way that it could have been different. It really does change a lot. Sliding back around to the original topic of Gore being in the big chair in the Oval Office after 9/11. Is there anything big that we've missed, Brody, that you had thought about that you wanted to make sure we covered?
I just thought of this, but Bush got a lot of Supreme Court nominations. Like the Chief Justice, I think he got 3 or 4 in. So we'd probably see a much more liberal Supreme Court.
Yeah. Or a court that would be closer to ballots, because there would have been both parties represented during that period of time where there was a changeover of positions. Probably no doubt about that.
At that time, there were 5 justices appointed by Republican presidents and 4 by Democrat presidents. If 3 retire or resign, I don't know if they were all from the Republican side. I know at least 2 were. So it would probably look like what it looks like today, just in reverse.
Right. Yeah. It's that's an interesting area. Those are the, even if it's only for a one-term period of time, that one term can have that lasting impact for that reason, particularly when there was a close scenario that's there.
We also remember the Carter presidency, just as an example of one term, or Kennedy. He didn't even get 1 term.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about the Kennedy presidency, I was actually talking to somebody about this the other day, is so much of what we think about being the results of the Kennedy presidency were Johnson following through on the initiatives that were started by Kennedy and then carrying them forward in a way that Johnson, having been the former majority leader, could do that Kennedy was going to have difficulty doing otherwise.
Yeah.
So much of the Kennedy legacy is Johnson carrying the ball for the Kennedy legacy that I think it's easy for us in hindsight to forget how short of a time that President Kennedy actually served in the office. He served for slightly more than
3 years.
Not quite 3 years, 2 years, and 2 years and let's say 10 months, roughly, give or take. Because of inauguration in January and then assassination in November, but certainly not even 3 out of the 4 years that he was elected.
Yeah.
And part of the reason he was in Texas, and all that happened was the fact that they were already gearing up for knowing they were going to have a very tough time winning re-election in '64. So
just a thought on that. One more piece of trivia at the Kennedy assassination. JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Johnson was from Dallas, Texas. Johnson was from Texas, inaugurated over Texas in Texas airspace. I think that's the only time a U.S. president has been inaugurated in his home state.
That's an interesting thing. Now I feel compelled to research because I think you may be right. And of course, and I'm not one of these that holds to this position, but there's some people that believe, sort of suspicious that it happened in Texas, and guess who gets to be the president? But we won't go down that particular path. All right. Anything else that we missed, Brody?
No. I think we touched on everything.
Okay. For my listeners here on A Fork in Time who may not have heard the last time that you were on the show, tell folks a little bit about Imagine If and what it's all about and how it works.
So Imagine If is also an alternate history podcast, although unlike A Fork in Time, we dive into more developed storylines rather than taking a broad look at all the different ways things could have happened. We look at one way things could have happened. Like I believe the episode I did with you was Abraham Lincoln, who suffered with mental health issues. Oh no, that was a different episode. William Seward ended up earning the Republican nomination instead of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and how William Seward handled the Civil War, and how unfortunately Houston got burned in the process.
Right. Yeah, I remember not liking that part of the episode. But to Brody's point, we both function in the same genre, but we do it in different ways, which is one of the things that I like about listening to Imagine If too. And Brody, and I'm always impressed by this, you spend a lot more time going into the details because you choose a singular path forward. So you need to flesh out that singular path forward, where we play it a little bit fast and loose here on A Fork in Time. Most of the time, not choosing just one. We choose multiple forks or multiple ripples that come from the fork, and really take it a little bit more from the analysis side versus the true, alternate history in the sense of a specific alternate timeline that extends out. And I know in many cases you've extended those timelines out, quite a ways.
Yeah, I know that usually takes a lot more research to figure out what would have happened if we had a Confederate States in World War I. That's
right. Yeah.
Very
and
interesting.
So I value what overlaps between our two shows, but I also value the differences, which is why I'm happy to have you on, and also happy to recommend to any Fork in Time listener who hasn't checked out the Imagine If podcast, and certainly in the show notes here for the version of this episode that will go on A Fork in Time, you'll have the link that's there to link over to access Brody's show, and we'll have him back again. As Alexis and I talk about all the time, we view what we're working on here as being part of the alternate history community. And in my mind, Brody is definitely part of that community. So we want to encourage the support for his show as much as we would encourage the support for our own. And I'm also very impressed. Brody, I'm not going to ask you to reveal your age, but you are far younger than I am. And I'm very impressed with your maturity, your knowledge and grasp of facts at your age. And I thought of myself as being pretty bright, precocious high school student. Yours is far superior to mine. What mine was at the time, and it shows both in the preparation for your episodes and how you execute them. So kudos for that.
Thank you. And I would recommend to all my listeners as well to check out A Fork in Time, because they do a lot of stuff a lot better than I do.
We're just
the benefit of experience.
Yeah, we're now we're getting longer in the tooth. As Alexis and I were talking about on the episode a few episodes back. We put a 1 in front of those numbers now. It's 3 digits, and that suddenly doesn't feel like a lot, but it feels like a lot. The other thing that I wanted to mention here, I haven't even had a chance to mention to Brody, so we don't know whether he is, but he's one of the people that I also think of at some point that may join us for the new venture that we're launching, our second podcast from our side, which is The Room Where It Happened, which takes us
the third podcast in our community.
Yeah, just we're trying to grow that and take a little bit of a different twist, because there are times, like a little bit we talked about here today, you almost want to talk about the real timeline or the real event as much as you want to talk about the alternate, but you still want to be true to the alternate, the alternate process. And so we're creating a space where we can do that a little bit more in terms of being a pure history podcast, but also, the recognition of tying it back to alternate events. So Brody, I appreciate you joining us again. I know we'll have you back. One last time, any last things you want to say to any of the listeners before we sort of bring it to a close?
One more thing I actually want to say to you, because if I have my math right, and there are 52 weeks in a year, I believe you're closing in on your 2-year anniversary.
We're getting really close. And again, I mentioned this on the last episode. We're really proud of the fact that we haven't missed a week. We've stretched a week here or there, but we haven't missed a week. I think technically I could actually pull it up here. I was looking at that today. The middle of May is when we actually hit that 2-year anniversary. So we're drawing upon it really close. And it's
depending on when
I intended this thing to sustain, but when I look back on it, wow, it has actually been 2 years. Wow, it's actually been 2 years, almost.
Yeah, depending on when you release this may very well be the 2-year.
Yeah, this will go out ahead of that. This one will actually turn around pretty quick because we're still putting the other stuff in the can for our run of episodes to have ahead. And now that I'm finally here, I'm actually going to get to the magic number. May 17th jumps out at me, but I'm not sure if that's actually what it is. The post date of episode 1 of A Fork in Time was May 17th of 2019 with episode 1. And I posted the little brief, less than 2-minute introduction introducing the podcast on May 4th. So I don't know if you want to call May 4th the official anniversary or May 17th. I would go with the May 17th because that was the first episode that was the full-blown episode, but we're getting there pretty close.
May 4th is already Star Wars Day. I think that one's taken.
Yeah, then we better just assume May the 17th. That way we're not competing. All right. Brody, again, I appreciate you joining us, and we'll do it again sometime soon. Thanks once again for joining us today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Hope that you enjoyed the joint show here with Brody from Imagine If. Just a reminder, if you want to find Brody's podcast, check the show notes. You'll see the link there to how you can get Imagine If and how you become a regular follower of that show. If you have a chance, visit our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com, and we look forward to having you join us next time on the show. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.